name is Alyssa, and I'm here to tell you about Johann Sebastian Bach's Christmas Oratorio. Before I begin, I want to share that before this project, I didn't know a lot about this work either, but as I listen to it and study it more, I've grown to love it so much. I hope that you have a similar experience. So my goal for this presentation is to give you a broad background for the historical context and theology that both play an important role throughout this piece, to tell you about the structure of the work, and hopefully to lead you to a deeper enjoyment while listening to or performing this oratorio. You've probably heard Bach's name before, but let's learn a little bit more about the composer before we continue. Bach is famous for his compositional output, both vocal, instrumental, and especially his keyboard works. He was born in a small town called Eisenach in Germany in 1685, and he began his musical studies at an early age at the prestigious school of St. Michael's. After serving in different positions of court musician, cantor, organist, and choirmaster in different German towns, he came to Leipzig, Germany in 1723, where he served as the cantor and music director at the St. Thomas Church, or Thomaskirche. The choir and school at St. Thomas provided music for 4 of the churches in Leipzig, 2 of which you'll hear a bit more about today. Bach was also a well-known pedagogue, teaching both performance skills and composition at St. Thomas. The legacy of this church and their choir lives on today, even with regard to this Minneapolis performance of the Christmas Oratorio. The soprano soloist is from Germany, and her son actually sings with the choir that Bach once conducted, the Thomanerchor, as did her father, grandfather. You can see how this is a legacy that continues. So the Thomanerchor and Thomaskirche, both highly influenced by Bach's work while there, are still integral to German musical culture today. The Christmas Oratorio was composed for the 1734 Christmas season in Leipzig. An oratorio is the sacred sister of the opera. It was often performed alongside the liturgy at church, and it had the same dramatic impact of an opera, but it did not include staging, props, or costumes. Rather, the music is what carried the story and the narrative. This oratorio is divided into 6 different parts, or cantatas, which is a short narrative work for instruments and voices. The 6 different cantatas were then premiered over 6 different feast days in the Christmas season in 1734. And they were performed at only 2 of the churches under the St. Thomas churches, 4, the St. Nicholas Church and the St. Thomas Church. However, due to some changing church schedules as well as this division of the work, it was only performed in full at St. Thomas Church. While the librettist, or the author of the text, remains unconfirmed to this day, the general consensus is that Christian Friedrich Henrici, who often collaborated with Bach and was a writer during this time period, and his pen name was Picander, was the author of the text for the Christmas Oratorio. The biblical texts for the oratorio come predominantly from Luke and Matthew's Gospels, and then the librettist would provide other poetic texts to reflect the sermon, the story, and the general affect of each liturgical day. Bach was not the first composer to write a large-scale Christmas composition. You might know the composer Heinrich Schütz also wrote something similar to this. But this oratorio is so important to German culture and also performed so often in North America, which is why it's pretty important that we bring it into our tradition. In order to understand the history and impact of the Christmas Oratorio, it's important to grasp what Christmas season meant in 18th century Germany. While the 1600s retained many medieval Christmas traditions, including festivity and carnivalesque celebrations, the 1700s took a turn towards this inward spirituality and internalizing the spiritual. The Christmas Oratorio reflects this in turn. Some of the movements reflect that festivity of the 1600s. There's a lot of jubilation, as you'll hear about later. but there's also moments for meditation where we are called to reflect upon what is happening in the story. We'll discuss that a little bit more when we talk about the structure of the work. The internal spirituality that permeated 18th century German culture played an important role in the relationship of theology and the Christmas Oratorio. First of all, one should note the intersection of the work and the church service. Bach composed this oratorio in 6 parts, as I mentioned before. 1 part for 6 different feast days in the church over the span of the Christmas season. The 6 different days then were Christmas Day and the 2 following days, New Year's Day and January 2nd, and the Feast of Epiphany, January 6th. The first 3 parts marked Jesus' birth, the Annunciation of the angels to the shepherds, and then the shepherds' adoration of the newborn child, Jesus. The following 3 parts narrate the naming of Jesus, the journey of the Magi to go see the newborn child, and then their subsequent adoration. The narrative structure was designed to fit the readings at each day's liturgy, and the librettist included biblical text relating to each day, or even perhaps heard right before the performance of each cantata during the day. However, the 5th and the 6th day had to be altered so that the timeline would make sense. The readings of the liturgy in the 5th day were actually Mary and Joseph's flight into Egypt, but this does not make chronological sense in terms of the oratorio if on the 6th day the Magi were supposed to be there adoring the newborn baby. Thus, the 5th day was altered to reflect the journey of the wise men, which also invites us, the listener, to participate in a similar journey. This change also shows Bach's preference for narrative coherence, as well as that invitation to us to join in the story, over just matching the readings at liturgy. Bach was clearly concerned with this idea of a coherent timeline, which also is reflected in the larger framework and understanding of time, both within this work in question and for 17th and 18th century Lutheran theologians. While the overall narrative is the telling of the Nativity story, a different overarching idea that permeates the work are the 3 different comings of Christ, that is, the past, the present, and the future. So the past, of course, is reflected in the narrative that is being told throughout this oratorio. The present is then reflected in our congregational singing when we all join together, as well as meditative moments that allow for the listener to reflect upon what is happening. These meditation moments were moments in the liturgy and in the music that did not progress the story, but rather gave time to reflect upon what the story means for any present-day listener of the oratorio. The future, then, refers to Christ's return at the end of times and for the glory of Christ in his final coming. Different movements, as you'll hear, look forward to Jesus' return at the end of days. So alongside this narrative of the Nativity story is the full story of redemption in Jesus' past and future comings, as well as the presence of him in our hearts at all times. Lutheran theologians of the 17th and 18th century spoke of Christ's threefold coming, in flesh, in spirit, and in glory, and the Christmas oratorio setting reflects these 3 manifestations of Christ. Finally, let us look at the compositional techniques and the structure of the oratorio as a whole. This piece was composed for a medium-sized ensemble, 3 trumpets, timpani, 2 flutes, 4 oboes, 2 violin parts, viola, choir, and soloists, and this thing called the basso continuo. The basso continuo was a characteristic feature of Baroque compositions, this Baroque time period being the time in which Bach was composing. The basso continuo served an accompanimental role to soloists, as well as a foundational role when it played along with the entire ensemble. The basso continuo consists of the low strings, the double bass and the cello, the keyboard instruments, either an organ or a harpsichord, as well as sometimes a bassoon. The inclusion of 4 oboes and 3 trumpets is especially noteworthy, as this instrumentation would not often be seen in liturgical services during Bach's time and was reserved for the high holy days, such as Christmas celebration. So this expanded instrumentation for the liturgy reflects the importance of this piece. As was mentioned earlier, the Christmas Oratorio was split into 6 different days and parts. Each of the 6 cantatas includes different kinds of vocal and instrumental movements. The chorus has a few different roles. There are 15 congregational hymns, moments for choral reflection, like we talked about before, and then movements where the choir actually takes part in the narrative, such as when in the 2nd cantata we're opened with the choir becoming a choir of angels, inviting the shepherds to take part in the celebration of Jesus' birth. You'll see that later if you watch Ho Yin's video. Then, the full vocal ensemble often begins each of the cantatas, but it's noteworthy that a sinfonia, or a movement for the orchestra alone, opens the 2nd cantata, setting a pastoral scene for the shepherd's role in the story. From the soloists, we get recitatives, which are not metered and often serve to progress our story. Arias, which are accompanied song for solo voice and instruments, and shorter arias called ariosos. The tenor soloist in particular plays a very important role, and he would be called the evangelist. This role is essentially the narrator, whose main purpose is to tell the story using the biblical texts in the unmetered recitative style, accompanied by only the basso continuo, which we spoke about earlier. In this oratorio, Bach borrowed pre-existing pieces and reset them, a popular compositional technique known as parody composition. A parody, in general, is a resetting of a pre-existing composition. You might have heard that word in terms of comedic parodies that we have today. The 2 different kinds of parody employed in this work are textual parody, where the music remains the same, but the text is changed, and compositional parody, where the existing music is rearranged and recomposed for a new purpose. The textual parodies then fell to the librettist, whose role was to make texts that would both fit with the musical affect and meaning, as well as just the text setting, how many notes you have with how many syllables. This is one reason for the hypothesis of Picander as the librettist for the Christmas Oratorio. Because of his inside knowledge of Bach's music, he would have more success in his textual parodies. The compositional parody, then, is a reworking of the music. For example, the final chorale of the Oratorio is a parody on O Sacred Head Now Wounded, a chorale originally found in Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Bach adds joyous interludes featuring the trumpets to affect the feeling of the final chorale. It's more joyful. While today we have copyright laws that often prohibit direct recomposition, the idea of parody in this sense preceded Bach by hundreds of years and was a compositional technique in this realm of music that continued long beyond Bach's time. In his parody composition, Bach borrows primarily from 3 different secular cantatas, or narrative musical works for instrument and voice. These 3 works are Hercules at the Crossroad, Resound Ye Drums, Ring Out Ye Trumpets, which was written for the Queen of Poland's birthday in 1733, and Praise Your Good Fortune, O Blessed Saxony, written for the coronation of the King of Poland in the next year, 1734. While there has been much debate over whether the transformation of a secular work into a religious setting actually takes away from that spiritual nature of the work, it's agreed that because of the successful parody that Bach and the librettist accomplished, that the general affect of the music serves both either the meditative or joyful settings in this sacred work, just as well as its secular narrative purpose. Christ's divine love and union with those on earth, especially at Christmas time, is integral to understanding this work as well as Bach's many other compositions. Even going back to his manuscripts for the Christmas Oratorio, one finds that Bach often drew a picture of a heart in place of the word Herz, which is German for heart. In many of Bach's other secular manuscripts, one encounters Bach's signature accompanied by the phrase Soli Deo Gloria, for the glory of God alone, showing Bach's own meditation on his musical works, even those for not religious settings. This was not only a practice of Bach, however. You might know the composer Handel also wrote for the glory of God alone. His inclusion of the heart in the manuscripts, while in part logistical, as he often ran out of space — Bach wrote a lot, as you probably know — it plays a more important role, though. The heart itself marks Bach's attention to divine's love role in the same way that the textual signature Soli Deo Gloria on other compositions confirms the Lutheran practices of that day. So the Christmas Oratorio is important for a variety of reasons, and we have only scratched the surface of the history and meaning of this beautiful work and influential composer. And its ability to remain relevant after 3 centuries is pretty remarkable. The elegance and beauty of the music penetrates listeners of all beliefs and backgrounds, and it captures both the religious spirit of the season for believers, as well as the secular sentimentality that accompanies Christmas today. Despite the changing meaning of Christmas throughout the ages and in different cultures, Bach's Christmas Oratorio has maintained a place of high renown and significance, and I hope that you have a similar experience as you journey through the Christmas Oratorio with us and in the live performance. Thank you.